Greetings, Insidious Nebula here, and I'm back with another video. My final video of October. It's been a minute since I added in some of me speaking, and not just narrating. I felt this special occasion demanded I do so. Happy Halloween, friends. As the month of spooky delights draws to a close, I felt we should end it with a bang, so to speak. So, I thought a gigantic collaboration was in order, featuring some amazing channels and people that I've come to know. All of the creators featured in this video, including the amazing authors, are so talented, and I'm so happy to be presenting their hard work on my channel. I hope I do them some justice with my editing skills. As they are. Make sure you check out the description and the pinned comment for a detailed list of all of the narrators and authors and their respective links. Now, enough of me babbling. Let us get to the video. I hope you enjoy this large and in charge dredge of the darkness.
I know the sign said kids corn maze, but that didn't stop us. Autumn was in the air and we were feeling the Halloween spirit. Besides, I think being a young couple still madly in love allows you to do some kid stuff. It becomes less about the thrill of kid stuff and more about the thrill of being together. The cutesy kid stuff becomes whimsical and charming. I'm pretty sure my girlfriend agreed with me. Lacey and I had been together for about 6 months at that point, and she'd told me all about Farmer Pete's Halloween haunt over at Downey Farms. It had been something of a family tradition for her since she was young. She didn't want this to be the first year she didn't go. Her parents were no longer around, and her sister had gone last weekend with her husband and their kids. Usually they brought her with them, but not this year. I suppose they figured she'd want to go with me instead. I'd never actually done anything at Downey Farms before. Sure, I'd gone to the storefront to buy produce with my own family, but I'd never done any of their seasonal activities. They really were more for kids, but we weren't the only couple who'd gone. My friend Steven had told me he'd gone with his girlfriend last year, and he'd seemed to really enjoy it. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't just as excited for it as she was. This was special to her, and so of course it was also special to me. After just 6 months, I could tell I wanted to spend the rest of my life with Lacey. She was a short brunette with an infectious smile and the cutest laugh I'd ever heard. I'd always thought of myself as a funny guy and loved to make bad jokes. Admittedly, I did try too hard sometimes, but Lacey didn't care. She usually laughed anyways, especially if the jokes were bad or just outright dark. We seemed to share the same morbid sense of humor. The sun was low in the sky by the time we got to the farm. We'd both enjoyed sleeping in before meeting up for lunch and watching a movie together. I'd hoped the crowds at the farm would be gone, but it seemed the attractions were more popular than I'd anticipated. "Watch out for the stroller," Lacey said as we were looking for a place to park. A young family with 2 little kids was making their way down the grass field that was being used for parking and toward us. "I'll go for the parents instead," I said, and she giggled. "If you get them both, maybe one of the kids will grow up into Batman." She raised her eyebrows playfully at me. I stopped the car and let the family pass. Their baby was fast asleep, but their little girl looked at my Nissan Rogue as she passed. She had big blue eyes and was cute as a button. I hoped I'd have a kid like that someday. We found a parking spot and made our way deeper into the farm. There'd been a good turnout that day. A tractor pulled a cart full of people to the different attractions set up along the farm. Lacey looked at the program on her phone. "So, we've got the haunted house, the fairy village, the corn maze, and the pony rides," she said, along with a few other things I wouldn't remember later. I could see the pony rides up ahead, along with the entrance to the corn maze. "Then the haunted hayride begins at 8, she added, "so we've got about 4 hours. The farm was bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon, and I wasn't entirely sure there'd even be 4 hours worth of activities. Well, let's explore first and see what comes to us, I said. That seemed good enough for her. We started walking towards one of the distant barns. I could see the haunted house up ahead, and beside it was a pen with a few of the farm animals, a couple of goats, and a tiny horse. "No thanks, we are already well fed. We don't need any more," said a sign on the fence. Lacey stopped a few feet away from it and admired a goat eating some of the fallen autumn leaves. She grinned with an almost childlike wonder at it, and I found myself grinning too. The goat continued to eat obliviously as it began to shit without a care in the world. Lacey looked at me, smile fading as she shook her head. Gross. I just chuckled at the obscene absurdity of it all. Guess he wants some privacy. "Hey, the haunted house is just over there. Want to check it out?" She looked over at it before giving a shrug. "Sure." I took her hand as we headed over. I could sense a bit of apprehension as we approached. I knew she didn't particularly enjoy those haunted houses, but I appreciated the fact that she tried. "Are you here for the haunted house?" asked the girl in front of us. She couldn't have been older than 17. I told her that we were. "Alright, well, what scare level do you want? Low, medium, or high?" I looked at Lacey and raised an eyebrow. She looked at me, eyebrows raised in turn. Without speaking a word, we had an entire conversation where we negotiated the terms of how scary we wanted the haunted house. "Medium," I finally said. Lacey seemed fine with that. The girl opened the door of the haunted house, stuck her head through, and screamed, "Medium!" before closing the door and grinning at us. "You can go right in." I took Lacey's hand and smiled as I led her through the medium haunted house experience. The set was pretty nice. There were rooms full of creepy dolls, spider webs, and hanging body parts. Just the atmosphere was enough to creep me out a little. The people wandering through the set and screaming at us were mostly out of costume, but they did their jobs decently. A teenager in a Toronto Maple Leafs jersey seemed to be stalking us from the other side of the far wall. As we made our way through the rooms, she'd peek her head through holes in the wall to scream at the top of her lungs. Every time Lacey flinched, the teenage girl grinned and snickered. That was the worst of it, though. Lacey was tense and laughing nervously by the time we left, and I kissed her hand to thank her for trying for me. "That was alright," she said softly. "The screaming was a bit much." It kinda was. I'm glad we settled on medium. Kinda wish we did low, actually. "Next time," she said, cracking a soft smile. She had the cutest smiles in the world. Up ahead, I spotted a sign for the corn maze. "Want to give that a try?" I asked, gesturing to it. "Yeah, for sure. Let's do it." She squeezed my hand as we headed toward the maze. The old stalks of corn stood tall, and a wooden sign depicting a zombie pointed the way. The word "Enter" was written across his arm. Lacey and I watched as a small family disappeared into the corn, and we followed them. The fallen stalks across the dirt path crunched under our feet as we made our way through the maze. Above the corn, I could see the grain silo against the late afternoon sky. It was a useful landmark to give me an idea of where we were. "Right or left?" Lacey asked as we reached a fork. The family ahead of us was long gone. Right," I said. It looked like it went deeper into the maze, and honestly, I kind of wanted to get lost. It was part of the experience, wasn't it? Lacey just smiled and made her way down the right-hand path, and I followed her. "Aw, honey, look." She paused as I caught up with her. "It's Elsa." Propped up on a post in the corn was the vaguely human shape of the beloved Ice Queen from Frozen. She looked to be just a human-shaped sack dressed in clothes with a face painted on. An old blue dress and white shawl adorned the figure. She had no hair, but someone had tied a wig into a braid and draped it over her shoulder. It was as good as it needed to be. "That's cute," Lacey said, and I snapped a picture. She continued onwards and stopped to point out Olaf a few feet away. "He's even got a little sign," she said. I could see it down by his feet. "How many stomachs does a cow have?" There were 4 possible answers down below. "That's cute," Lacey said again before we continued on. A few feet later, we also saw Peppa Pig and her family, as well as what I think was Paw Patrol characters. Lacey didn't stop to fawn over these ones as much, but we did call them out as we saw them. We paused for the educational little signs as well. "Did you know that baby goats are called kids?" She read off one of them. She looked at me. "I don't know. Did you know that?" "I had no idea," I said, half jokingly. Lacey nudged me as we continued on. "Is that Frozen again?" I asked as I saw a white shawl on the corn ahead of us. Her eyes narrowed as she approached. "It looks like it. Yeah, that's Elsa. Did we go in a circle?" She looked around, but this area of the maze didn't seem familiar. "I don't think so." "Maybe they just repeat," I said, and shrugged. Lacey seemed to accept that as an answer. "Probably." She looked down the aisles of the maze, and I looked around for the grain silo I'd been using to keep us oriented. "Let's try left," I said when I spotted it. "That should take us closer to the exit." Lacey continued off to the left, and as she did, I heard movement behind me. On instinct, I looked back, expecting to see some other patrons of the maze approaching us from behind. Instead, I saw nothing. Not even the white shawl of the Elsa dummy. I frowned, but kept walking. I didn't think too much of it. There wasn't really a reason to suspect anything sinister. Not yet, at least. Lacey stopped ahead of me when she saw another trivia sign. This one had been knocked over. She bent down to pick it up and set it right, but her brow furrowed as she read it. "How many children did Lightning McQueen kill?" she murmured and looked at me. "Lightning McQueen didn't kill kids. Teenagers pulling a prank, maybe?" I asked as I read the sign. I turned it around and knocked it into the corn, and then gave the base a kick to hide it. "That's just mean. Kids might read that." Lacey nodded in agreement before continuing deeper into the maze. Around a bend in the corn, we paused as we reached a dead end. The Paw Patrol figures were waiting for us. There were 4 dogs painted on old sacks, and they were placed side by side at the edge of the corn. Their eyes stared down the narrow rows directly at us. It felt like they were waiting for us. "Guess we're intruding," Lacey murmured. "They look upset." She smiled at me and began to turn around. I didn't leave just yet, though. They did kind of look upset. Their eyes seemed way too focused on us. I turned away, looking back as if I was expecting them to follow me. The Paw Patrol did no such thing. They just continued to stare. Of course they did. They were just sacks painted to look like fictional dogs. They'd probably been put there to soften the blow of a dead end for any kids. This was a kid-friendly maze, after all. "There's another one of those signs," Lacey said from up ahead of me. "What's it say this time?" "How many teeth does Tom Hanks have?" I looked over her shoulder at the sign, which read exactly that. But the multiple choice answers underneath were even weirder. 32, 427, 8,021. Infinite. If that's supposed to be a joke, I don't get it, I said. "Me neither," Lacey murmured. She looked up at the maze ahead of us and bit her lip as she spotted Sheriff Woody peeking out of the corn rows. "Christ. That's not creepy at all," I murmured. "It's just a prank, hon." I took her hand and escorted her past the beloved animated sheriff, glaring suspiciously at him all the while. "Let's just get out of this maze," Lacey said. "This is starting to wear out its welcome." We picked up the pace as we walked. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear movement in the corn. The sky was a pastel pink with orange hues, and the air around us was dead silent. No kids, no animals, just our footsteps and the rustling in the corn. Lacey looked back anxiously and held my hand tight. Ahead of us, I saw another sign with a farm fact posted on it. "When you die, who takes you to hell?" I didn't stop to let Lacey get a look at it. I just kept walking. "We should be almost out," I murmured as I looked at the grain silo again against the darkening sky. It seemed a lot closer than it had been before. That was good, right? "Yeah." She didn't sound convinced. Still, we kept walking. We kept walking until we saw the shapes ahead of us. Then we both stopped in our tracks. Lacey's hands went to her mouth, as if masking a scream. I could only stare in horror. In the path ahead of us were 3 corpses. Not props. Real corpses. They'd belonged to the family who had come in ahead of us. I recognized the jacket on the little boy who, thankfully, lay face down in the dirt. I would have broken down crying if I'd had to see his face. The father lay partially in the corn, eyes staring vacantly up into the sky. His mouth was open in a scream of terror, and blood trickled down his slit throat. The mother lay in a heap on the ground. I could see blood on her white shirt, though, enough to stain parts of it a dark red. The blood was still wet. These were fresh kills. "Oh my God," Lacey murmured. "Oh my God." She pressed herself against me, and I wrapped my arms protectively around her. "I'll call the police," I murmured, and reached for my phone. Attempting to dial anything failed, though. I had no signal. Neither did Lacey. My heart skipped a beat as I heard the corn rustle behind us. Both of us turned around immediately. There, standing in the middle of the corn maze, was Peppa Pig. The burlap she was made from was stained with blood. The wooden post that kept her in place was planted firmly in the ground, and she stared at us defiantly. She sure as hell hadn't been there before. "We're leaving. Now," I murmured. I looked up at the silo before taking Lacey's hand and pulling her into the corn. I was done with the maze. I just wanted out. We moved as fast as we could, and I kept that silo in sight. It wasn't far, maybe just a 5-minute walk. We could make it 5 minutes, right? Behind me, I could hear the corn rustling. I could hear movement. My heart was racing, and it almost stopped when I heard Lacey cry out. "Lacey! I'm okay. It's just another fucking sign." There, amongst the corn, I could see it. In the fading twilight, I could only barely read the text. "Who will find you when we are done? Your mother? Your father? The police? No one?" The words "no one" were circled in blood. I looked up just past the sign, and through the corn I could see something blue and white. I could only barely make out the painted-on eyes of Elsa watching us, and behind her I swore I could see Sheriff Woody. There was a rustling behind us, and I turned to see Peppa Pig, almost close enough to touch us. Lacey let out a startled cry and shrank back. I grabbed her hand and started to run. It was barely even a minute before we broke through the corn, but by God, that minute felt like it took forever. We did break through, though, and found ourselves on another path of the maze. "Damn it," Lacey murmured. "Let's just cut through the corn again, then we'll call the cops." I wasn't so sure that was a good idea. The grain silo didn't seem to be any closer. It seemed to be in the exact same place. "I don't think we should," I said. I think they didn't like that." Lacey opened her mouth to argue with me before falling silent. The corn rustled around us, and she inched closer to me. "Maybe they didn't," she murmured. "Let's just go then. We'll get out normally." She took my hand and took off down the row. Our walking quickly turned into running. I spotted additional signs on the path, more than I'd seen before. I briefly saw glimpses of Woody, Elsa, Peppa Pig, and others amongst the corn. Pooh Bear watched us from one fork in the road, and when I looked back, I saw him and Tigger standing side by side in the path, as if blocking off our return. "Where's the fucking exit?" Lacey said under her breath. Come on. She checked her phone again, hoping for a signal, but still found nothing. I just held her hand and focused on continuing forward. The sky was getting darker, and I could hear the movement among the corn. They were coming. "There's something up ahead," Lacey said. "I think I see the exit." We broke into a run, sprinting for the escape. Sure enough, there was a clearing just ahead of us. Maybe it was a way out. It had to be. As we emerged into the clearing, though, we realized the truth. It was not an escape. This was something else entirely. My breath caught and my blood froze in my veins as I looked at the figures around us. All human, all strung up like scarecrows. I could see the family we'd discovered earlier amongst the corpses, but there were so many more. 15, 20 perhaps, maybe even more. "There are 2 empty ones," Lacey said softly, and my eyes were drawn to them. They were set to face each other. And somewhere in the deepest part of my mind, I knew why. We wouldn't be dead when they mounted us. They wanted us to watch each other die. That was where the thrill was, wasn't it? The corn rustled behind us, and I turned to see Peppa Pig watching us from the edge of the corn. It may have just been the darkness, but I could have sworn she was smiling, and I could have sworn that her mouth was open, and I could see drool dribbling down her chin. Lacey took my hand, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. We both took a step back as Peppa Pig loomed into the clearing. I could see Elsa and Woody behind her. I could hear the rustling of their movements. They moved bonelessly and shuffled forward. It was inhuman and strange to watch. But they did it all with single-minded purpose. They had come for us, and nothing would deter them. "Let's go," I said. "Run. Run." She didn't need to be told twice. Again we ran, breaking through the wall of corn ahead of us. This time we had no direction. We just wanted to get away from the horrible things that were following us, and I didn't know if that was even possible at this point. We ran blindly, hands linked as we fled, swatting corn out of our way. We ran until we broke through the corn one last time and stumbled out into the main event area. Lacey broke down crying as she saw the haunted house we'd been through. I saw the pony giving its final ride of the day. "We're out! We're out!" She threw her arms around me and I hugged her back in turn. She laughed that laugh I'd fallen in love with, and I was laughing too, until I saw it. At the edge of the corn, I could see Peppa Pig watching us. I held my girlfriend closer, leering at the creature that had hunted us, silently praying it would retreat. It did. Slowly, Peppa Pig pulled back until she vanished into the corn. She'd been there for only a few seconds, long enough to let us know how close they'd been to catching us. They were gone, and so were we. We didn't report the bodies to the police. Lacey didn't agree with that, but I know she understood. I didn't know if the police would even find any bodies, and even if they did, my story about being chased by Peppa Pig and Elsa through a corn maze would sound too insane to warrant checking out. Even if I'd lied and only said that I'd discovered the bodies, the police would still have questions I couldn't answer. In the end, it was easier to not bother. I love Lacey. One day I want to marry her. She is my best friend. She is the love of my life. She is my partner in crime and in everything else. I would do anything for her and with her, but I will never return to Downey Farms, regardless of what her family tradition is. And I don't think she will either.
The thick gray clouds blocked out most of the light, giving the street a dark appearance and making my heart race. It was a strange feeling, to be so afraid with no conscious reason to be afraid. I walked quickly, watching as the clouds swirled and moved in odd patterns that I've never seen before. I was used to New England winters and the cold that could creep in unexpectedly, but this was different. The wind was fierce, but not cold. The clouds were uncommon. The dull daylight that managed to shine into them showed swirls of colors not normally seen. I sped up, positive that something was going to happen. Across the street, a man took off running, his hair whipped around his head in a frenzy and his clothing was torn and bloodied. I froze, watching him. I was in a kind of shock. This wasn't normal. A moment after he ran by, 3 young men ran after him. They were laughing and screaming, calling to him. I watched him look back once and then turned a corner. His eyes were desperate. I could feel his fear because I was also afraid. I started walking again, eyes peeled for any dangers. Across the street, the world seemed to have lost its mind. I saw groups of men and women chasing people. I saw people dying in horrible ways that made me feel like I was going insane. A young man in a black and white striped t-shirt was chased until he tripped, then a group of women tore him apart with their hands. They were literally ripping at him like zombies in a horror movie. The crazy people across the street would stop and stare at me, but they did not cross the street. Their victims would see me, stop and scream, begging me to save them. I was tensed, ready to run, but no one came toward me. They would glare at me. I would shiver, shake, and tremble. Then they would go back to whatever insanity they had been engaged in before. My heart thumping painfully, I began to run. I had no idea where I was going. I was just running before the madness could reach me. I stumbled against a wall and stopped to breathe when suddenly a knife sank into my leg. At first, I did not feel any pain. The shock was way too great. After what seemed like hours, my leg began to burn and I squealed. I looked up and across the street was the wild-looking man I had seen being chased by a gang. His eyes were wild and his hair red with blood. I realized abruptly that it was not his blood that turned his clothing red, not his blood that dripped into his eyes from his hair. He lifted another knife and with a flick of the wrist threw it at me from across the street. I screamed and fell onto the ground, the knife in my leg digging deeper as I landed on it. The pain was so intense that I felt my vision going black. I yelled at myself I couldn't pass out. The man would kill me. Without a shout of glee, the man raised another knife, aiming again. This time, I would not be able to move away. His knife would find my flesh, and there's nothing I could do. I stared at him, uncomprehendingly, the knife taking up all of my vision. The man shouted and threw the knife, it saying as it bit through the air. I closed my eyes, braced for the pain. After a long moment, I realized the pain had not come. Had the man missed? I squinted. What I saw made me open them further. Standing next to me was another man. He was impeccably dressed. He wore a dark suit and shoes. His hair was black and his skin pale. In his hand, which was decked out in ruby rings, he held the knife. The man across the street looked sane for a moment and very much afraid.
"She is mine,"
the man said, and while his voice was barely more than a whisper, it carried across the wind and over screaming in the street. The wild man heard and dropped to the ground, begging and crying. I could not understand what was going on. Suddenly, the well-dressed man threw the knife back toward the wild man, and it landed perfectly, deep in his back. The wild man screamed, and the well-dressed man smiled. The blade began to glow without cause. It burst into flames. The fire spread down the wild man's tattered clothing. Within moments, he was engulfed in flames. The well-dressed man turned toward me, and I began to tremble in earnest. His eyes were the deepest blue. They seemed to see into me. He knelt beside me, carefully not to let his knee touch the sidewalk. Without a word, he reached down and pulled the knife from my leg, and I bawled. My screaming faded into hysterical sobbing, and the man smiled, pleased with the sound of my pain. He reached up, his hand inches from my face, and I pulled back, but there was nowhere to go. He laughed softly, reached out. I closed my eyes tightly. Time passed slowly. I was afraid to open my eyes. When I finally did open them, I realized I was on the school campus lawn. A dream? I began to realize I had fallen asleep lying in the grass while studying. Laughter bubbled up hysterically. I gathered my books together and stood quickly, but fell. The pain shot through my leg was unexpected and shocking. I pulled up my jeans to show a nearly healed wound in my leg, right where the blade had cut me. Panic, I looked around. The wind began to whip around my face as thick gray clouds moved in. I saw a man wearing a black and white striped t-shirt run past me. "Better get home, big storm's coming," he yelled at me as he went. Suddenly I realized that I was on the wrong side of the street. I was on the side of madness. Leaving my books, I stood and tried to hobble across the road. Stopping in the middle of the road, I saw a man waiting for me. A man with deep blue eyes and a well-kept black suit.
I think it's finally time that I write this down. It's haunted me for years, but maybe this will help me move on. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for what happened that night. I was 15. My girlfriend, her brother, my best friend, and I had come up with the brilliant idea to stay out all night on Halloween. We had the perfect plan. My friend Art, not his real name, and I would tell our parents that we were going to spend the night at Layla's and Will's, not their real names, house. Likewise, Layla would tell her parents that she and Will would be spending the night at my house. I know, it was stupid, but we were confident that our plan would work. I wish the plan had failed. That Halloween night, we'd set out feeling like total rebels. We'd all decided on a group costume, and each of us was dressed as a DC superhero. Will had dressed as Superman, Art was the Flash, Layla was Supergirl, and I was Batgirl. We were all pumped. We had the whole night to stuff our faces with candy, hang out, and do whatever we wanted to. After we'd trick-or-treated for about 3 hours, I'm not kidding, people started shutting their doors. By 12, there wasn't a single light on or door open. We 4 were the only people out on the street, and with the exception of a barking dog, there was no noise. Layla and I were bored, and I asked if we should just go home. Will refused. "You're at a sleepover at my house, remember? And I'm sleeping at yours. Do you want to be the one to admit to your mom that you lied?" "Come on, Will," Art spoke up. He'd been eating a lot of candy and had been pretty quiet for the last few minutes, likely battling a massive stomachache. "This isn't as fun as you said it would be. Maybe it'd be better if we just went home and told the truth. They'd be mad, but maybe we can still have an actual sleepover." Will looked at each of us and realized that he was the only one who wanted to stay out. He sighed and looked like he was about to relent. Then he looked behind us, and his face lit up like a jack-o'-lantern. "What's that?" he said excitedly, already beginning to move towards it. I turned around. Not 20 feet away was a house that I'd never seen before on our street. It looked like a typical townhouse. That's usually what you see in our neighborhood, but it was covered from porch to chimney with Halloween decorations. And not the cheap plastic ones you get at the dollar store, but the quality makes you want to run decorations that give kids nightmares. There were 2 disturbingly lifelike pumpkin-headed scarecrows guarding the front gate, and over 24 skeletons standing at attention in the front yard. Jack-o'-lanterns dotted the porch, each one with a face frozen in agony. A gigantic spider was perched in the show window, looking like it intended to make the shrub it was hovering over its next meal. Bones were scattered across the roof, as if someone had just dropped a handful of them from the sky. And, for the finishing touch, a spotlight hidden among the shrubbery made the entire house glow an eerie purple. Layla and I glanced at each other. How had we not seen this house earlier? Granted, we hadn't been paying close attention to every house we passed, but still, we'd been all over town. We'd have noticed a glowing purple house, right? I turned to ask Art, but he was just as entranced as Will. Before I could blink, he was running towards the house too. Once again, I glanced at Layla. She shrugged her shoulders as if asking what I expected from 2 Halloween-crazed boys. I grabbed her hand, and we ran after them. Up close, the house was even more disturbing. The scarecrows eyed us as we walked through the front gate. I tried not to gag as I passed them. Someone had certainly taken liberties to make the yard believable. The things stank like rotting pumpkins. I gripped Layla's hand a little tighter as we passed the skeletons. They must be from one of those expensive artisan websites, I thought. They sure didn't look fake. We walked up the porch steps, with Will shaking from excitement. Art's eyes were practically glowing. I remember wondering, half-jokingly, if they were in some kind of trance. Will rang the doorbell. It was the sound of a church bell and resonated throughout the house. "Trick or treat," we shouted dutifully, although Layla was practically crushing my hand. I was grateful for it. I needed to know that I wasn't the only one who found all of this unsettling. The door was practically thrown open. A gorgeous woman stood in the doorway. She had long legs, thick copper hair that stopped at her shoulders, black eyeliner, and blood-red lipstick. She was dressed in a revealing witch costume and grinned when she saw the 4 of us. Well, when she saw the boys. My, I didn't expect to be visited by 2 handsome heroes tonight." She gave a high-pitched giggle. Her voice reminded me of how ladies in old gangster movies talked. Art smiled and thanked her. Will was just staring at her. I took a step closer to Layla. That's when the lady noticed us. I think she knew immediately that we weren't as captivated as the boys were. Not by her house or her beauty. Sure, she was gorgeous, but she was an adult and I was already with Layla. Her eyes glazed over as she saw us, but her smile didn't waver. I noticed then that she was holding a bowl of candy. She slowly extended it to me. "Candy, Batgirl?" I wrapped both of my arms around Layla and took a step backwards from the lady. I could tell she wanted something and that it wasn't anything good. "No thanks, we've eaten too much candy already." It wasn't a lie, we'd eaten half of our candy throughout the evening. The woman's smile wavered, and she blinked 3 times, as if it was the last thing she'd expected. I noticed something strange about her eyes. They were kind of cloudy. She turned and offered candy to the boys. Will took a full handful, while Art only took 2, obviously still suffering from a stomachache. I glanced again at the candy. The pieces weren't in wrappers, and it didn't look like any brand I'd ever seen. It sort of resembled malted milk balls, except bigger and lumpier. When the boys had finished their candy, the woman looked at the 4 of us. "You must be parched. Why don't you come in for some apple cider?" She gestured to the front door, which stood gaping open, like a mouth. Layla physically leaned away from the door. She wouldn't go in there for $1,000, let alone a glass of cider. I agreed with her. I forced a smile. "No, thank you." We turned and started to get down off the porch when I realized that Layla and I were alone. Will and Art were gone, and so was the woman. My heart rate tripled. They went in the house. My stomach hurt. Should we call the police? What could we say? That a pretty lady with a spooky yard had lured 2 boys into her house with apple cider? Even if that didn't sound crazy, we were 2 teenagers out past midnight on Halloween, not exactly what the cops would consider trustworthy. Plus, we couldn't prove that she wanted to hurt the boys. Still, we had to make sure that they were okay. We started walking around the house. On the left side, there weren't any windows. This made sense, though, it being a townhouse and all. The back of the house had a porch, but the windows and doors were all covered. The right side of the house yielded the same results as the left, leaving us only one option: the show window. We maneuvered around the skeletons in the yard and went as close as we dared up to the window. I, being dressed in black and thus harder to see, decided to look in the window, while Layla, dressed in bright red and blue, made sure the lady didn't come out of the house. Before peering in, I took an uneasy glance at the giant spider. Against my better judgment, I touched it. Solid plastic. I sighed and told myself not to be so jumpy. I peered through the window. I was staring at a lit fireplace. It seemed to be the only light source in the room. It was pretty dim in there. Still, I could make out 2 enormous armchairs on either side of the fireplace. I could make out Art's bright red Flash costume, and I could see the blue from Will's costume. They were both slumped in the chairs, as if asleep. There was a coffee table between the chairs, holding 2 half-empty glasses of what could only be apple cider. In the center of the room stood the lady. She was standing up as straight as a rod, her arms lifeless at her sides. Then, with no warning, her right arm shot straight up. She held it there for a second, then let it fall. A second later, she did it again, with the other arm. Then, I swear, she started growling. As if this was a signal, Will and Art got up. I could tell that their eyes were closed, but they came right over to her. She put her left index finger on Art's forehead, and her right index finger on Will's forehead, and she began to chant. Veneninum santiatum, age, puer, languorem santias, nesico quomodo, lantianam, loqui, ut alligent. All 3 of them suddenly began to convulse. Art went down, followed by Will. They both started to kick wildly. Then their kicks became weaker, as if they were losing energy. Then they stopped. I must have made a noise. Layla told me later that tears were streaming down my face. I must have sobbed without knowing it because the lady turned around. Her eyes were completely blue, with no pupils to be seen. Her mouth was hanging open, with saliva the color of her eyes dripping from her lips, and her face was starting to melt. I screamed. Layla screamed. I shoved myself away from the window and landed flat on my back. The wind was knocked out of me, but I was too scared to care. Layla yanked me to my feet, and we just started running. We charged through the skeletons, which I now thoroughly believe were real. As we charged through the gate, I knocked over one of the scarecrows. Its head smashed to bits on the ground, revealing a human skull underneath. We ran, not knowing where we were going and not caring. We finally ended up in front of my house, and we both collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing. I told my mom everything. At first she thought I was making up a story to get out of lying to her, but one look at our faces and she knew we were serious. She called the cops immediately. When they investigated the strange house, they made a shocking discovery. It belonged to a Miss Smith, not her real name, who was a woman in her 20s and fit our descriptions. But she'd been on vacation in Alabama with her mother for the last 2 days. They never found their bodies. Art and Will remain missing to this day. The police don't believe our account of some life-sucking witch. They believe that a child predator drugged them and ran off with them. I don't think Layla and I ever really got over it. We broke up in 12th grade when she and her family moved away for a fresh start. A few months later, I moved too. We text now and then, but we aren't as close as we used to be. Still, I'm glad I've saved her number all of these years, because tonight I saw something that brought back that traumatic Halloween. A townhouse, bathed in purple light, with skeletons set up in the front yard. 2 of them guard the gate. One is dressed in a Superman costume. The other is dressed as the Flash.
Pumpkins sang. The flickering lamppost cast the streets of Terrytomb in a dull glow, but the illumination of the bonfire within them, the residents could do without it. Vampires, princesses, and fairies flitted about, baskets swinging from their hands. Superheroes chatted idly with creepy clowns holding their balloons, and skeletons warmed their bones by the satisfying heat. All were dancing to the song of the night, smoke curling up towards the moon like greedy claws to a pearl. Pirates and demons worked in tandem to keep the fires roaring. Bats and black cats mingled on the side, while jack-o'-lanterns smiled in a barely contained excitement. Little werewolves eagerly galloped through the fields, squealing and devouring candies from their bursting sacks. In the hollow of Terrytomb, all was jubilant, and the town celebrated in harmony. On the verge of the festivities, a young witch felt a tug on her cloak. She peered under the wide brim of her hat, turning her attention to a small ghost at her side. Do you know where my mommy is?" it asked in a small, scared voice. Immediately, the witch took pity on the poor thing. It was covered in white, draped all the way to the ground, with 2 tear-filled eyes that met her. "I haven't, sweetheart," she cooed, her long black nails clenching her broomstick for balance as she stooped down to meet its gaze more evenly. "But I'd be happy to come look for her with you. What's your name, little one? Where did you last see your mommy?" By the Jensen house," the ghost sniffled, shifting anxiously. "I'm Liam." The witch paused. She didn't recognize any of those names. "Sorry, dear, I don't know them," she said, her voice calm and kind. "But come, let's search together." The specter nodded, and the witch straightened up. She didn't offer her hand, as the little ghost seemingly had none. But then, suddenly, from underneath the veil of white, a long, skinny, pale arm emerged and stretched towards her. The witch screamed, and everything stopped. The music, now interrupted, screeched to a halt. Heads tuned in all directions, trying to find the source of commotion. The bats squeaked and flapped their wings, and the cat's fur bristled in agitation. The ghost began to cry, and the sheet slipped from his head, fluttering like a useless tissue to the ground below. Almost in unison, Tiratum gasped. The werewolf children howled in alarm. Zombie's jaws dropped to the floor. Jack-o'-lantern's chiseled grins shifted into little O's of surprise. All eyes were turned upon the sobbing child and the witch, who recoiled backwards in absolute shock. After a few seconds of utter silence, the witch finally composed herself. She dropped her broomstick to the ground and knelt beside the child, taking him into her arms. "Oh, I'm so sorry, darling. We just don't get many visitors like you here," she murmured, stroking his hair as he whimpered and shook. "Everything's perfectly all right. You're just turned around, that's all." She withdrew from his little body again, using her black cape to dry his blotchy red eyes. "Would you like to join our party until your mother comes to fetch you, Liam?" The child stared at the crowd, hesitating. The residents waited with bated breath. When he gave a little nod, the group cheered and released. The werewolf children, eager to introduce themselves to a new friend, rushed forward to show him their games. The witch smiled as she watched his sad eyes brighten, his sheet forgotten as he was dragged into the fun. The party continued itself, and the bonfire burst back to life. The pumpkins resumed their song.
I Grew Up by Samantha Miyake, performed by Storytime with Grax. My father died from pulmonary hypertension when I was only 4 years old. I still remember the night he had the heart attack, watching from the third-floor window of my great-grandmother's bedroom as he was wheeled onto a stretcher across the driveway. Hell, I still remember the bare and twisted trees in the front yard, their shadows creeping like eerie tendrils across the lawn. This has little to do with the story I'm about to tell, but it illustrates a point to all those who have questioned my validity in the past. My memories of earlier childhood have always been very clear, especially during that time of loss in my life. This is not something I imagined. This is not a memory that is vague to me. If I can remember that fateful night, I'm sure that I am remembering this perfectly. The real story started in the middle of October, not long before I lost my father. Halloween was my favourite day of the year, and the entire month leading up to it was always a time for excitement. There would be nights where I would lay awake in bed, thrilled by the thought of dressing up as a cat for the 3rd year in a row and what have you. One night in particular, after my mum stuck her head in our room and scolded me for being up, I forced myself to close my eyes and attempted to drift off. I was almost there, just on the edge of sleep, when I heard the door slowly creak ajar. Being a clever kid, I thought it was my mum and kept my eyes closed while feigning cartoon snores that, well, in reality, she totally would not buy. It was my assumption that my mum would eventually leave, satisfied that I had finally nodded off. But instead, the door creaked even wider, and heavy footfalls began to trot into the bedroom. Eventually, I dared to peek with one eye open to see what was going on. What I saw was not my mum at all, but a monster. He was by no means scary. In fact, he was kinda cute, covered entirely in thick orange fur. He towered over my bed with a wide grin of pointed teeth. 2 gnarled ram horns sat on either side of his head, and due to his size, they almost scraped against the ceiling. The monster did not acknowledge my sleeping little brother in the bed across the room. Instead, he held a clawed hand out for me to take. I'm not sure why I thought it was okay, but I accepted his gesture and placed my tiny palm within his and held it tightly. Slowly, he led me across the room and towards a blank space of wall, where my mother had been intending to put some sort of wicker furniture. I watched in curiosity as the orange monster gently scraped a wide door shape against the wallpaper with his claw, and in an instant, a gateway had appeared. Still leading me with the utmost care, he stepped through and we were engulfed in a bright light of flash that forced me to squint. As it faded and my eyes adjusted, I found that we were no longer in my bedroom. We were in what I can only assume to be his world, and it was a world that I marveled at. A cobblestone marketplace stretched on before us, filled with stands and carts manned by every kind of monster you could picture. Witches cackled from a booth full of frothing potions, and they gave me candy corn as we passed them by. Vampires chilled beneath the shade of an awning, selling decorative vials of blood that glowed like obscene stained glass. There were werewolves, skeletons, mummies, and so much more. All of them busy preparing for Halloween, and all of them very friendly. Making our way through the market seemed to take hours, but it eventually led out into a wide park filled with trees and another glimmering gateway at its entrance. My monster guided me there, and after exchanging a warm embrace, he ushered me through the gates and gave me a cheerful wave goodbye. And then I woke up in my bed. My brother was still sleeping soundly across the room, and the blank wall was back to being blank. During breakfast, I told my family the wild tale. My mother reacted the way you'd expect the mother of a 4-year-old to react to some made-up story. My dad just smiled weakly. It was a dream, and I figured that was the end of it. But it had been such an exciting one. I wish I could have had it all over again. 1 year later, my wish came true. It was the middle of October again, and though it was still an exciting time, I no longer had trouble sleeping. But once again, one night, I awoke to the creak of my bedroom door, and I opened my eyes to see my orange monster shuffling into the bedroom with a sheepish smile. I sprang out of bed to meet him, and yet again he drew the doorway on the wall with his claw and took me to his world. Everyone was excited to see me, and all of them remembered my name. The witches gave me candy again, and the vampires hissed hellos. It went the same way as the last dream, winding through the busy marketplace until we reached the gates at the park and bid each other farewell. The next year I had the dream again, and the year after that again. It had started to become my yearly Halloween tradition that only I knew about. It wasn't until I was 11 that the dreams began to change. That year, none of the monsters in the marketplace seemed happy to see me. They gave me and my orange monster stern looks as we passed, whispering in hushed voices that I could not understand. There was no candy for me, no greetings, no smiles. It was a unnerving trip, and I think that my monster knew this, for he began to pick up his pace and was quick to lead me to the park. When I was 13, the marketplace became a hostile environment. All the kind creatures I had come to know for almost a decade shouted in harsh voices. They pointed with bony fingers, spitting angrily, and ordered us to leave. For the first time, my monster actually picked me up and carried me through, not stopping until I was safely at the gateway. I was 16 when the dreams finally became nightmares. My monster had come for me, like he always did each year, but something about him was different. His plush orange fur had grown thin and wispy, and his ram horns had various chips and cracks in them. He still held out his hand and took me through the doorway, but that was a grave mistake. We were chased through the market, bitten and clawed and slashed at. My ears were filled with whispers, loud enough to drown in, but nobody's mouths were moving, and it almost seemed like they were being spoken in tongues. I was too big for my monster to carry, but I let him pull me along to the park. The other creatures followed us all the way to the gateway, not leaving any time for goodbyes. I was shoved through and woke up drenched in sweat in my bedroom. 17. My monster was a shadow of what he once was when he came to collect me. There was no chasing in this dream, no sense of imminent danger. There was, however, a massive dread that hung over us as we ambled through the cobblestone marketplace. The creatures stopped still at the booths, black holes in place of their eyes and mouths. They turned and stared as we passed, though they were otherwise motionless. My monster had to stop often to catch his breath before we made it into the park. Before I entered the gates, I enveloped him in my arms and squeezed him tight, like I had done as a child. He looked at me with sadness in his eyes, but grinned with those big teeth and ushered me forward like he always did. When I woke up, I found my eyes were wet with tears. The next year I wondered if perhaps I would have the dream again. It was very late in October, much later than usual, and I had yet to dream my dream. On Halloween night, after late night partying with friends, I dreamed in a daze that someone was clawing at my walls. I got out of bed and moved cautiously across the floor to see that the light-filled doorway to my monster's world was wide open. My bedroom door, on the other hand, was shut, and I was completely alone. I went through the gateway by myself, wondering if perhaps he was waiting on the other side. Again, I was met with change when I found the long cobblestone street was empty, void of all structures and life. The only thing that accompanied me were the long smears of dark, brown blood, and the scatterings of what I could only assume to be flesh. There was a horrible rotting smell that made me cover my nose with the collar of my pajamas and forced me to make the familiar walk with trembling legs. For hours I walked, my bare feet slipping in blood and gore, staining my toes and making me shudder. I called out, but was only met with the sounds of the wind whispering through the streets. As the marketplace ended and gave birth to the park, I came to a halt, and my stomach churned violently. There were corpses in my path now, of the witches, the vampires, the werewolves, and monsters. They were mangled, horribly disfigured and discarded in piles carelessly. No longer were they eyeless or cruel-looking, but the friendly creatures I'd imagined when I was very young. I was slipping through more blood, more flesh, and was now dodging bodies and bloody bits of candy underfoot. Straight ahead was the gates of the park, and staring before them was a familiar sight. The recognizable shape of my monster was waiting for me, but his back was turned. His fur was also very patchy, I noticed, revealing a muscular grey body that bulged and twitched with veins. The closer I drew, the better I could hear his deep rasping breaths. He did not turn to face me, but instead seemed hunched over something. My foot connected with a limb and I tripped, yelping in surprise. The voice that came from my mouth was higher, though, sounding much younger than that of an 18-year-old's. The sudden cry made my monster freeze, and slowly he turned to face me. In his claws, he held the dismantled remains of some sort of corpse. Its stinking brown blood stained his fur. When he saw me, he grinned with a new set of razor-sharp teeth. The smell of decay breezed out of his mouth, and I found myself gawking at the bits of flesh that dangled from in between his fangs. I was a child then, drowning in my adult pajamas and feeling my eyes welled up with tears. I stumbled back to put space between us and choked back a tiny sob when he reached out for my hand. "Why?" I pleaded, overtaken with fear as he drew up to a much higher height and loomed over me.
Because
He answered. It was the first time I heard his voice, yet I knew he did not sound that way. He spoke in a low rumble, wrong and inhuman, like something ancient and not of our world.
you grew up.
Again he held his hand out with splayed open claws, but I did not take it. I shoved them away and went scurrying over the bodies below, making my way towards the gateway as quickly as I could. I awoke in my room with my mother standing over me, demanding to know why I was screaming in my sleep and if I needed to go to the hospital. I'm 23 now, and I haven't had the dreams since, and if I'm being honest, I don't think I'll ever will. I still think about them from time to time, musing about it to my husband and friends. They always shake their heads at me, laughing and reminding me that nobody remembers things like that at such young ages. It must have been one dream, all thought up at once and made to feel as though it had been reoccurring. But I know that's not the case. I remember. I still remember.
O those who burn'st in heart for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed in turn, how long be crying, mercy on them, God? Why, who art thou to teach and he to learn? In the church of St. Barnaby, vespers were over. The clergy left the altar, the little choir boys flocked across the chancel, and settled in the stalls. A Suisse in rich uniform marched down the south aisle, sounding off his staff every fourth step on the stone pavement. Behind him came that eloquent preacher and good man, Monsignor C. My chair was near the chancel rail. I now turned toward the west end of the church. The other people between the altar and the pulpit turned too. There was a little scraping and rustling while the congregation seated itself again. The preacher mounted the pulpit stairs, and the organ voluntary ceased. I had always found the organ playing at St. Barnaby highly interesting. Learned and scientific it was, too much so for my small knowledge, but expressing a vivid if cold intelligence. Moreover, it possessed the French quality of taste. Taste reigned supreme, self-controlled, dignified, and reticent. Today, however, from the first chord I had felt a change for the worse, a sinister change. During Vespers it had been chiefly the chancel organ which supported the beautiful choir, but now and again, quite wantonly, as it seemed, from the west gallery, where the great organ stands, a heavy hand had struck across the church at the serene peace of those clear voices. It was something more than harsh and dissonant, and it betrayed no lack of skill. As it recurred again and again, it set me thinking of what my architect's books say about the custom in early times, to consecrate the choir as soon as it was built, and that the nave, being finished sometimes a half-century later, often did not get any blessing at all. I wondered idly if that had been the case at St. Barnaby, and whether something not usually supposed to be at home in a Christian church might have entered undetected and taken possession of the West Gallery. I had read of such happenings too, but not in works on architecture. Then I remembered that St. Barnaby was not much more than 100 years old, and smiled at the incongruous association of medieval superstitions with that cheerful little piece of 18th century Rococo. But now Vespers were over, and there should have followed a few quiet chords, fit to accompany meditation while we waited for the sermon. Instead of that, the discord at the lower end of the church broke out with the departure of the clergy, as if now nothing could control it. I belong to those children of an older and simpler generation, who do not love to seek for psychological subtleties in art, and I have ever refused to find in music anything more than melody and harmony. But I felt that in the labyrinth of sounds now issuing from that instrument there was something being hunted. Up and down the pedals chased him while the manuals blared approval. Poor devil, whoever he was, there seemed small hope of escape. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Who was doing this? How dare he play that in the midst of divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one appeared to be the least disturbed. The placid brows of the kneeling nuns still turned towards the altar, lost none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadow of their white headdress. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at Monsignor C. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing an Ave Maria. But now, at last, the preacher had made the sign of the cross and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far, I had not found the rest I had counted on when I entered St. Barnaby that afternoon. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst, and it was an exhausted body and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive which I had brought to my favorite church for healing, for I had been reading The King in Yellow. The sun ariseth, they gather themselves together and lay down in their dens. Monsignor C. delivered his text in a calm voice, glancing quietly over the congregation. My eyes turned, I knew not why, toward the lower end of the church. The organist was coming from behind his pipes and passing along the gallery on his way out. I saw him disappear by a small door that leads to some stairs which descend directly to the street. He was a slender man. His face was white as his coat was black. Good riddance, I thought. With your wicked music, I hope your assistant will play the closing voluntary. With a feeling of relief, with a deep, calm feeling of relief, I turned back to the mild face in the pulpit and settled myself to listen. Here, at last, was the ease of mind I longed for. My children, said the preacher, one truth the human soul finds hardest of all to learn is that it has nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it. Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he will reconcile that with the Fathers. Nothing can really harm the soul, he went on, in his coolest, clearest tones. Because... But I never heard the rest. My eye left his face. I knew not for what reason, and sought the lower end of the church. The same man was coming out from behind the organ, and was passing along the gallery the same way. But there had not been time for him to return, and if he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill, and my heart sank. And yet, his going and coming were no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite me, he turned and sent across the church straight into my eyes a look of hate, intense and deadly. I had never seen any other like it. Would to God I might never see it again. Then he disappeared by the same door through which I had watched him depart less than 60 seconds before. I sat and tried to collect my thoughts. My first sensation was that of a very young child badly hurt, when it catches its breath before crying. To suddenly find myself the object of such hatred was exquisitely painful, and this man was an utter stranger. Why should he hate me so? Me, whom he had never seen before? For the moment, all other sensation was merged in this one pang. Even fear was subordinate to grief, and for that moment I never doubted. But in the next, I began to reason, and a sense of the incongruous came to my aid. As I have said, St. Barnaby is a modern church. It is small and well lighted. One sees all over it almost at a glance. The organ gallery gets a strong white light from a row of long windows in the clerestory, which have not even colored glass. The pulpit in the middle of the church, it followed that, when I was turned toward it, whatever moved at the west end could not fail to attract my eye. When the organist passed it was no wonder that I saw him. I had simply miscalculated the interval between his first and second passing. He had come in the last time by the other side door. As for the look which had so upset me, there had been no such thing, and I was a nervous fool. I looked about. This was a place likely to harbor supernatural horrors. That clear-cut, reasonable face of Monsignor C, his collected manner and easy, graceful gestures, were they not a little discouraging to the notion of a gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head and almost laughed. The flyaway lady supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in a high wind, at the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft. She would point her gold trumpet at him and puff out of existence. I laughed to myself over this conceit, which at one time I thought very amusing, and sat and chuffed myself and everything else from the old harpy outside the railing, who had made me pay 10 cents for my chair before she would let me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than was my organist with the anemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, Monsignor C himself. For all devoutness had fled. I had never yet done such a thing in my life, but now I felt a desire to mock. As for the sermon, I could not hear a word of it for the jingle in my ears. The skirts of St. Paul has reached, having preached us those 6 Lent lectures, more unctuous than ever he preached, keeping time to the most fantastic and irreverent thoughts. It was no use to sit there any longer. I must get out of the doors and shake myself free of this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still, I rose and left the church. A spring sun was shining on the Rue Saint-Honoré as I ran down the church steps. One corner stood a barrow full of yellow jonquils, pale violets from the Riviera, dark Russian violets, and white Roman hyacinths in a gold cloud of miasma. The street was full of Sunday pleasure seekers. I swung my cane and laughed with the rest. Someone overtook me and passed me. He never turned, but there was the same deadly malignity in his white profile that there had been in his eyes. I watched him as long as I could. His lithe back expressed the same menace. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear him on some errand connected with my destruction. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to move. There began to dawn in me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I deserved that which he threatened. It reached a long way back. A long, long way back. It had lain dormant all these years. It was there, though, and presently it would rise and confront me. But I would try to escape as I stumbled as best I could to the Rue des Rivoli, across the Place de la Concorde, and on to the quay. I looked with sick eyes upon the sun, shining through the white foam of the fountain, pouring over the backs of the dusky bronze river gods, on the faraway arc, a structure of amethyst mist, on the countless vistas of gray stems and bare branches faintly green. Then I saw him again, coming down one of the chestnut alleys of the Cours la Reine. I left the riverside, plunged blindly across the Champs-Élysées, and turned toward the Arc. The setting sun was sending its rays along the green sward of the Ronde Point. In the full glow, he sat on a bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed at the malignant hatred of his face. But he was not looking at me. I crept past and dragged my leaden feet up the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought him nearer to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate, and still I tried to save myself. The last rays of sunset were pouring through the great arc. I passed under it and met him face to face. I had left him far down the Champs-Élysées, and yet he came in with a stream of people who were returning from the Bois de Boulogne. He came so close that he brushed me. His slender frame felt like iron inside its loose black covering. He showed no signs of haste, nor fatigue, nor any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing, the will and the power to work me evil. In anguish I watched him where he went down the broad, crowded avenue that was all flashing with wheels and the trappings of horses and the helmets of the Garde Républicaine. But he was soon lost to sight. Then I turned and fled, into the Bois, and far out beyond it. I know not where I went, but after a long while it seemed to me night had fallen, and I found myself sitting at a table before a small cafe. I had wandered back into the Bois. It was now hours since I had seen him. Physical fatigue and mental suffering had left me no power to think or feel. I was tired. So tired. I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home, but that was a long way off. I live in the Court of the Dragon, a narrow passage that leads up from the Rue des Rennes to the Rue du Dragon. It is an impasse, traversable only for foot passengers. Over the entrance on the Rue des Rennes is a balcony, supported by an iron dragon. Within the court, tall old houses rise on either side, and close the ends that give on the two streets. Huge gates swung back during the day into the walls of the deep archways. Close this court after midnight, and one must enter then by ringing at certain small doors on the side. The sunken pavement collects unsavory pools. Steep stairways pitch down to doors that open onto the court. The ground floors are occupied by shops of second-hand dealers and by iron workers. All day long the place rings with the clink of hammers and the clang of metal bars. Unsavory as it is below, there is cheerfulness and comfort and hard, honest work above. 5 flights up are the ateliers of architects and painters, and the hiding places of middle-aged students like myself who want to live alone. When I first came here I was young and not alone. I had to walk a while before any conveyance appeared, but at last when I'd almost reached the Arc de Triomphe, again an empty cab came along, and I took it. From the Arc to the Rue des Rennes is a drive more than half an hour, especially when one is conveyed by a tired cab horse that has been at the mercy of Sunday fete makers. There had been time before I passed under the dragon's wings to meet my enemy over and over, but I never saw him once. And now refuge was close at hand. Before the wide gateway, a small mob of children were playing. Our concierge and his wife walked among them with their black poodle, keeping order. Some couples were waltzing on the sidewalk. I returned their greetings and hurried in. All the inhabitants of the court had trooped out into the street. The place was quite deserted, lighted by a few lanterns hung up high in which the gas burned dimly. My apartment was at the top of a house halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street, with only a bit of passageway intervening. I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruinous stairs rose before me, leading up to rest and shelter. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw him. 10 paces off. He must have entered the court with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly nor swiftly, but straight on to me. And now he was looking at me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the church, they met now again, and I knew that the time had come. Retreating backwards down the court, I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance on the Rue du Dragon. His eyes told me that I would never escape. It seemed ages while we were going. I retreating, he advancing, down the court in perfect silence. But at last I felt the shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring through to the street, but the shadow was not that of an archway. It was that of a vault. The great doors on the Rue du Dragon were closed. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me, and at the same instant, I read it on his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer. The deep vaults, the huge closed doors, their cold iron clamps were all on his side. The thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows. The point from which it would strike was his infernal eyes. Hopeless, I set my back against the barred doors and defied him. There was a scraping of chairs on the stone floor, and a rustling as the congregation rose. I could hear the Suez's staff in the south aisle, preceding Monsignor C. to the sacristy. The kneeling nuns roused from their devout abstraction, made their reverence, and went away. The fashionable lady, my neighbor, rose also, with graceful reserve. As she departed, her glance flitted over my face in disapproval. Half dead, or so it seemed to me, yet intensely alive to every trifle, I sat among the leisurely moving crowd, then rose too and went through the door. I had slept through the sermon. Had I slept through the sermon? I looked up and saw him passing along the gallery to his place. Only his side I saw. The thin, bent arm and its black covering looked like one of those devilish, nameless instruments which lie in the disused torture chambers of medieval castles. But I had escaped him, though his eyes had said I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him the power over me came back out of oblivion, where I'd hoped to keep it. For I knew him now, death, and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him. They had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I had recognized him almost from the first. I had never doubted what he was come to do, and now I know while my body sat safe in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragons. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. Dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away, the arches, the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and I saw the black stars hanging in the heavens, and the wet winds from the lake of Hali chilled my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond, the towers of Carcosa rose behind the moon. Death and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness had long ago sent him, had changed him for every other eye but mine. And now I heard his voice, rising and swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance increasing, poured over me in waves of flame. And then I sank into the depths, and I heard the King in Yellow whispering to my soul,
It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God.
My last Halloween. Halloween used to be my favourite holiday. It was the time of year you could be anything you wanted to be. You could draw out your darkest desires and display them for the world to see. No one would think you were odd for being the person you always wanted to be. There was no judgment for your choice of attire, and oftentimes, you were commended for that choice. Then at the end of the night, you received a reward for your efforts in the form of a bag full of candy. I am far too old to go door to door begging for treats, but I enjoy watching my children do the same. Weeks in advance, we would let them pick their costumes. They are far too young to delve into the ghastly, and usually end up picking a character of a popular movie or TV show. I simply take my pictures and urge them on to each doorway. I always remind them to say trick or treat before the door opens. It has been this way for a few years now, but I am starting to question the tradition, especially after visiting 113 Forest Road. This past year we made the rounds of our local neighbourhood. We made sure only to approach homes that had their porch light on, which was the unspoken rule. Our night had almost come to an end when we reached a home that had been vacant for the last 2 seasons. It was the largest within our neighbourhood, towering at 2 stories when all others only had 1 level. It was a large brick Victorian monstrosity that may have once been beautiful, but the landscape had long needed work. It was the house most kids made stories about, and when we saw the dim glow of that yellow bulb, I was unsure of letting my children approach. My oldest begged to ring the doorbell, and my youngest simply wanted more candy. I was outnumbered and relented at their pleas. My wife sat within the idling vehicle while I followed close behind. The 2 made their way up the steps, and I waited at the bottom. Like always, I reminded them of what to say. My oldest son held his brother's hand and pressed the lighted button. Ringing, much like church bells, echoed from within the house for a moment, before returning to silence. After a few seconds, they turned to me with questioning looks. I had noticed a moving truck parked outside the home earlier in the month and knew someone must live there, but I had not seen them. There was no car in the driveway, and I did not see any lights on inside. I started to think they were simply gone and left the light on in case it was dark by the time they returned. I waved to my children to come back to the car and told them we would just head home. The look of disappointment on their faces told me they were not ready to end the night just yet. Their faces lit up as the door creaked to life, and a voice beckoned them to wait. "Trick or treat!" they both screamed with excitement. A feeling rolled in me like thunder, and a signal of danger rang in my head. Something was not right. If they were home all this time, where was the car I had seen sitting in the driveway the last few weeks. I instinctively advanced on my 2 children, taking the steps in leaps. A feeling inside me told me they should not go towards that voice, and I called for them to stop as they turned towards the door.
I choose both.
The voice seemed strained, like that of a lifetime smoker. 2 ragged hands shot from the parted pathway and drew both of my little boys inside. Their screams echoed in my head. My adrenaline shot me forward, but my body slammed against the closing door. I pounded repeatedly, screaming obscenities of every nature. My body shook violently as my world became a spiral of despair. The whole scene drew the attention of my wife, and soon she was right behind me. In an effort to find entry, I took a step back, lifted my right foot, and dropped it full force into the hard wood. The door frame shattered, allowing the barrier to fly freely into the darkness. I cried out in terror for my little boys as I rushed through each room. My entire reason for living had been snatched up in an instant, and I had been too late to stop it. When the house had been searched completely with no results, my wife phoned the authorities through wails of agony. We both held each other until the sirens lit up our tiny neighborhood. It has been a year now, and we still have no answer as to what happened to our children. My wife distanced herself from me, and I am sure she blames me for what happened. I don't fault her for that. I blame myself as well. If I had not let them go to that door or listen to my feelings sooner, they would both still be here. Halloween is no longer a time of fun for us, but a reminder of our mistakes. I don't even leave my house on that night, and even the sight of a pumpkin makes tears stream down my face. The drive home from work is especially hard, witnessing the houses that decorate for the occasion. I am almost in a panic before I close myself within the safety of my home. Please, if you read this, don't let your kids visit 113 Forest Road on Halloween.
I'm a demon who accidentally sends souls to heaven. How the hell did this happen? I'm lazy, yes, but come on. What do you expect? I'm not an angel. Anymore. I give myself big goals knowing everyone is in the same boat. That boat being something on the river Styx. Anyway, this typical suffering judgment. Nothing fancy in a workday here. Yeah, it's a dirty job. Although I really fear as if I'm being overlooked, so definitely the pressure on me is as massive as the stone blocks we keep putting onto people. Halloween is coming up on Earth, and I have a hankering for some pumpkins. Hellas Horseman, up yours. You ain't got nothing on me. At this time, we're free to roam Earth for a limited time. Sometimes it's nice to be out of hell. One can only take smelling brimstone for so long before madness sets in. Oh, and before you ask, only we demons can roam free. Not the human souls. They're screwed. Anyway, we're expected to catch souls on our own, and I'm dangerously low on meeting quota. Although my job isn't made any easier by everyone who does magic. Seriously, I have more respect for birthday magicians than those morons. You ever try to enter our house plastered with a protective sigil intended to ward off demons? It friggin' hurts trying to go past that bastard. You humans think rug burn is bad? Anyway, I'm near a Victorian-style house that even freaks me out. Irony, yes, I know. And find some burglars in the process of robbing it. Why? I don't know. And don't care. I'm here for them. I think to myself, this would be like taking candy from a baby, which some of my kind have actually done, but me, I won't do that crap. Even I, the demon, have standards. So I'm thinking, take them off guard, scare the hell out of them by letting them see me, then take their souls. Piece of cake. Boy, how life has different plans for us all. Using my rad demon powers, I focused my effort on the old Victorian-style roof to make it crash down onto their heads. And nothing happens. Damn! I had to encounter the one old house built sturdy. However, I don't give up easily. Their souls are mine. I focused on one of them acting as a lookout. He should be an easy target. However, this kid must be psychic or something and freaks out because he sees me and takes off running. Screw this, I'm thinking. I put all my efforts into it with my powers and yes, make that roof crash down onto them. I go looking for them into the rubble. They're not there. Turns out the little torpor bolter wasn't the only one. Turns out there was a basement door leading out to the backyard they left through before the roof collapsed. Well, at least I demolished someone's house. Hey, vandalism also counts. And I realized my fudge up. Turns out the house is haunted. Okay. The young punks left because they were scared spitless by the ghosts in the house, suffering a crisis of conscience like having a bout of diarrhea. Again, damn you, irony. Me destroying the house freed the ghosts imprisoned in it, allowing them to cross over. I actually saw them rise into heaven. Overrated, by the way. Hey, I should know. One of them even thanked me, which definitely makes me ill. I would get drunk right now if I could. I can possess someone, sure, but the effort is out of me. Earth sucks. I can't go back to hell or I'll be a laughingstock. Vegas or bust?
Servitude Hotel Welcome Message by Reddit user JB-Baxter1.
The following is a transcription of our welcome package message. For a PDF copy, please click the link below.
Greetings and welcome to the Servitude Hotel. We thoroughly hope you enjoy your stay. If there is anything that we can do to make you feel more comfortable, please don't hesitate to let us know. Our maintenance staff cleans our units daily and would be more than happy to replace any dirty sheets or towels you may have. Please place them on the floor if you would like them replaced. Forgot a toothbrush? No worries. Our front desk has plenty of complimentary toiletries to offer in case you forgot something. Remember, you're more than welcome here. You'll find a coffee maker on the nightstand along with some complimentary coffee packets. If you ever need more, feel free to call the front desk or stop by and we can give you some more. Caffeine keeps us alive, right? Our smart TVs are compatible with all of the latest streaming services in addition to offering a large variety of channels. With so much content, you'll never want to leave your room. If you have any questions about setting up a game console, call the front desk during safe hours and someone will come up to help you. Important! We would like to remind you that 10 p.m. to 10 a.m. are unsafe hours. During this time, guests are not permitted to leave their rooms. Make sure to keep your blinds drawn and to ignore the whispers from outside. If you feel a headache develop, turn on the TV and watch until it subsides. Remember to keep the bathroom light on at all times. They can't watch you from the mirror if the light is on. You may notice that the paintings in our units tend to move about at night. No matter what horrific scenes they show you, remember that they are incapable of harming you physically. You will see colorful patterns move about in your bedroom at night. If you see these patterns, it is safe to get up and use the restroom. If it is dark and you only see shadows, do not attempt to leave your bed and close your eyes till they leave. Under no circumstances should a guest look out of the peephole past 10 p.m. The first time you look out, you'll see nothing, followed by a white figure popping up in the corner of your vision. Look away immediately. If you see him once, you're okay, but if you look at him a second time, he'll be at the door and won't leave. Look at him a third time and he'll be right behind you. Peace, comfort, tranquility. Once again, we thank you for staying with us. We don't just hope you'll come again. We know you will. Sincerely, Servitude Properties.
You've probably never heard about him. The abominable toe man. Ask people around these parts, though, and you'll get at least a dozen different stories about him, all of which are utterly ridiculous. Some say he was a nighttime lurker, a fetish chaser. He'd break into young women's homes at night, sneak into their bedrooms, and suck on their toes. According to some local legends, he had a particular penchant for foot fungus. Liked the way it tasted. Others, though, claim he was a freak of nature, possibly a failed lab experiment, or a mutated aberration of some kind. A creature of innumerable appendages, all of which were variations of toes. He'd crawl around like a centipede on thousands of little piggies, prowling the deep woods out by Fletcher's solitude. Woe be the day you smelled those toes. By the time you did, it was already too late. The truth, though, is far simpler in nature. Or perhaps more intricate. I suppose it depends on how you see it. The county sheriff covered up most of it, you see. Only a handful of people ever knew, and only certain details deemed unimportant were ever leaked to the press. I had some connections in the department, though, and being an investigative journalist at the time, I knew I was onto something big when old John Colliker, drunk as several skunks and then some, told me the truth about the abominable toe man. He'd claimed 5 victims at that point, and the 6th and last was right around the corner. They found them tied up to chairs on seemingly random locations, dry black streams of blood running from their mouths. The victims were more or less unharmed, some minor surface wounds, but nothing too severe. Except for the feet, of course. It varied from victim to victim, you see, how many toes were missing. The first one had 3 missing. The second had 5, all severed rather crudely, probably using diagonal pliers of some sturdy design. But the blood loss from the wounds still wasn't enough to explain the cause of death. The autopsies revealed all. You see, the abominable toe man was a sick, sadistic son of a gun. He liked to cut off his victims' toes and feed them to them. Made them eat them. Chew them. Swallow them. I don't know about you, but chewing on my own toes isn't something I'd willingly do. So most of the victims had attempted to swallow them whole, and choked to death on them. They never caught him, you know. After the 6th and final victim, he disappeared. Just stopped and upped and vanished. I suppose he was satisfied, got what he came for. Something to that effect, anyway. Why am I telling you all this? Well, you asked, didn't you? How I lost my feet? It's rather simple, isn't it? Quite obvious, really. I finished my meal.
Halloween's the best holiday of the year. No, not because of the sweets and costumes, though the outfits some people come up with really are something, but because of the excitement. Everyone is anticipating the coming holidays, no one more so than yours truly. You see, I'm a pumpkin farmer. It's a sort of family tradition at this point. Each generation has improved and upgraded the business, making it grow bigger and better every time. This year, it's my go. I've spent at least 2 years on this plan now, and it's going to make the biggest, best pumpkin patch you'll ever see. You see, my invention is a seed, but not just any seed. I've made them so that all they need to grow is a little soil, and they'll be growing faster than a weed in manure. My pumpkins will be the best in town. No one will stand a chance. Currently, it's Halloween night, and I'm waiting to try out my babies. That is what they are at this point. I spent so long loving and nurturing them. I wait in my house for my first visitor to arrive. I hear the doorbell, and I go to open the door. I'm met by a lone girl, about 16 or 17, dressed in a short cheerleading dress, covered in blood. Fake. I know real blood when I see it. And currently trying to discreetly hide the cigarette she was smoking.
Trick or treat,
she says, looking completely bored out of her mind. I smile at her, but she doesn't react, instead holding out her hand, obviously gesturing for sweets. My smile doesn't falter as I give her a single chocolate piece, nor when she husks in annoyance and struts down my garden path, stopping only to flick her half-lit cigarette into my flower bed and eat the chocolate piece I gave her. It doesn't even falter when she starts to choke and turns around in horror and confusion, showing the large pumpkin-sized lump in her stomach, slowly growing larger and larger with each terrified breath she takes. When she collapses to the ground, the pumpkin having finally ruptured her stomach and torn through her skin, I smile even wider. My babies worked wonderfully. I turn to go back inside my house, but out of the corner of my eye, I see a young boy walking up the path, candy bag in tow, completely oblivious to the corpse just feet away from him, hidden under a sea of vines and an island of pumpkin, smiling just as happily as I am. It seems I had another walking bag of sorrow up for grabs. I hold out my chocolate, my babies, excitement building as I imagine how big this pumpkin patch will be. Halloween really is the best holiday of the year.
There was a boy named Lenny who really loved Halloween. It was his favorite holiday and he always tried to celebrate in style. Every year he would save up his money and buy the best mask, the best costume, and the best decorations. This year was no different. Lenny was getting ready to go to a Halloween party at a friend's house. He got dressed up in a shaggy black coat, big black boots, and a long flowing cape. Then he put on his Halloween mask and admired himself in the mirror. It was the most scariest, most hideous mask that he had ever seen. He was sure that everyone at the party would be terrified when they set eyes on it. He would be the envy of all his friends. When Lenny turned up at his friend's house, the party was already in full swing. He could hear the dull sound of music coming from behind the door. He rang the doorbell and his friend answered it. She greeted him and ushered him inside. He looked around the living room. Some people were dancing and others were talking, laughing, drinking, and nibbling at the buffet. There were witches, ghosts, skeletons, vampires, and zombies. None of the masks were very scary. Lenny was sure he had the best one. He stood there and waited for someone to comment on his mask, but nobody paid any attention to him. He was disappointed. Wandering around the room, he tried to give everyone a good view of his mask. He wanted them to be scared. He wanted to cause a stir. One girl tapped him on the shoulder and started talking to him. "Hey, who are you supposed to be?" she asked. Lenny tried to reply, but he found he couldn't move his mouth. The mask felt too tight. He was embarrassed. So he turned away and went into the kitchen to get himself a glass of Halloween punch. He tried to pull off his mask so he could take a drink, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed to be stuck fast to his face. He pulled and tugged on it, but no matter what he did, he couldn't get it off. Lenny was starting to get worried. It was hot inside the house, and Lenny could feel himself sweating under the mask. He needed to get it off. He needed to get it off now. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen drawer, he went into the bathroom and locked the door behind him. He looked into the mirror and started scratching and tearing at the mask, but it really hurt. It was as if the mask was firmly stuck to his skin. Getting desperate, he took the knife and sliced into the mask, cutting off little strips of rubber and tossing them into the sink. Gradually, a line formed outside the toilet and people started getting impatient, knocking on the door and calling out, "What's going on in there?" Lenny was in a panic and he tried peeling off the rest of the mask, but it stubbornly stayed in place. He couldn't understand what was wrong. What if it won't come off, he wondered. What if it's stuck on my face forever? He began hacking at the mask with the knife again and ripping off little bits. More and more people were banging on the door. "Come on," they shouted. "What are you doing in there?" From inside the bathroom, they heard Lenny shrieking, "It won't come off! My mask, it won't come off!" The people gathered outside the bathroom gave each other worried looks. One of the girls was puzzled. "Mask," she said, but he wasn't wearing a mask.
The Robbers. Written by Reddit user Certain Shadows. The sound of my bedroom door creaking open roused me from my sleep. I drowsily opened my eyes and realized with a jolt of unpleasant surprise that the comforting glow of my nightlight was now extinguished. The house's electricity had gone out. Before I could roll over to face the doorway and ask my parents what was going on, I heard a voice pierce through the room's darkness. "It's just some kid," a woman whispered. "He's still asleep. We have the money. Let's go." I froze. My stomach plummeted and my heart raced. Were I not lying down, the incredible fear surging throughout my petrified body would doubtlessly have sent me collapsing onto the floor. I pressed my lips tightly together, forcing back the scream threatening to burst free from my mouth. "Are you serious?" a man's voice hissed incredulously. "There's 2 dead bodies in the other room, and you want to leave a potential witness alive?" Silent tears streamed down my face. It took every ounce of my self-control to remain unmoved. If the pair realized that I was awake, I knew they would kill me. "I didn't want that to happen either," the woman shot back, anger seeping from her hushed tone. "You said there was supposed to be no one home, that they were supposed to be on vacation. So I got my wires crossed. What's done is done. Now, what are we going to do about this?" I heard a low, heavy sigh. Sweat droplets trickled down my forehead and landed on my sheets. "Look, the kid hasn't even seen our faces," the woman stated calmly. "What's he going to tell the police that can be traced back to us?" "And you want to risk that?" her companion argued. "I told you. No loose ends. He's not a loose end if he didn't see anything. Listen, you're either in this with me, or they're gonna find 4 corpses come this morning. There was a long, tense pause. I held my breath, terrified that I would be betrayed by the thundering of my own pounding heart. "You'll make it quick and painless?" the woman asked quietly. "Of course," her partner replied silkily. "Come on, help me pin him down." Murderous footsteps approached my bed. Defenseless, I gripped my blanket tightly and shut my eyes. Suddenly, I heard 2 heavy thuds, followed by a succession of frightening screams. Somehow, I found the courage to look up. I peered over my bed and watched wide-eyed as the pair were dragged beneath it. They clawed at the floorboards and pleaded and wept, but it was no use. Within minutes, they disappeared from my sight forever. Bones snapped, and something wet spilled onto the floor. Then the room fell silent. I've been sitting in the darkness ever since, praying for the sun to rise before the sound of unsatiated growling returns. I loved my parents, but they were wrong. There is a monster under my bed.
Beware of Pumpkinhead by me, Insidious Nebula. This tale will serve as a warning to anyone reading it. I only hope that you all heed my warning and not think of me as another crazy fool sharing bullshit on the internet. My entire story boils down to this. Do not, and I repeat, do not attempt to summon Pumpkinhead on All Hallows Eve. It will not end well for you. Bloody Mary might as well be fucking strawberry shortcake by comparison. My friends and I thought the legend of Pumpkinhead nothing more than a stupid story meant to frighten children, but we were dead wrong. Speaking of dead, the Halloween of 1997 brought with it many violent deaths, something our small town, Melberg Hollow, rarely saw. My name is Adam, if you care to know. I was just a normal guy back then. I enjoyed video games, watching TV, collecting action figures, and most importantly, hanging out with my longtime friends. My group consisted of myself, James, Bill, Harry, Josh, Hunter, and William. We were all so close, as in brother close. It had been that way since our middle school days, and Halloween was our night to get mixed into the shenanigans that bonded us together. Every year, we would gather together like a coven to spend the scariest night of the year in unison. When we outgrew trick-or-treating, our Halloweens would be spent doing other things, like drinking, smoking weed, playing card games, or just partying the night away. As I've said, the Halloween of 1997 will forever live in infamy. It started like every year. The holiday fell on a Friday, so we, being the good, level-headed boys we were, skipped school. We all decided to meet up early that evening and hang out for the night. My friend Josh concocted an idea to visit a house on the outskirts of his neighborhood that was supposedly haunted. A haunted house would make for the perfect backdrop to Halloween, after all. On October 31st, 1947, a local man went absolutely ballistic and murdered his entire family with an axe in that house, leaving their severed heads on pikes outside of the home. When the police arrived, the man blew his brains out with a revolver in front of them. It was the most gruesome crime Melberg Hollow had ever seen, and it left its mark on the town. This Halloween would be the 50-year anniversary of the bloodbath, so Josh figured it would be an excellent way to spend our night and maybe get in a scare or two. It was said that the events of the murders would replay themselves starting at 11:45 p.m. on Halloween. Unexplained voices, sounds, and even manifestations of ghastly images. Sounded good to us. We managed to find someone to score us some beer, as well as some weed, and James stole some liquor from his parents. Tequila, and the good shit at that. So we packed up into William's pickup truck, and we headed to the house. William parked his truck, aptly named the shit wagon, at the entrance to the dirt road leading to the house, and we hopped the fence that surrounded the entrance. The place itself was massive and creepier than hell. The wood was weathered, and the house was missing shingles. The place was damn near falling apart, much more noticeable as we approached. The wind howled as it cut around the house and into us, chilling us to the bone. As Josh stepped onto the porch, the house groaned and creaked, as if it were alive. We all made our way onto the porch, but noticed William was missing. We were all on edge. There was absolute silence. We heard a low groan coming from the woods next to the house, as well as rustling in the leaves. We were about to shit ourselves, just standing there staring at each other, when William popped out and let out a shriek. "You piece of shit," I said jokingly, but audibly relieved. "We thought Mr. Axeman got your ass."
"Hell no, I just wanted to scare you pussy stiff,"
William said with a grin. "So, we going in or what?" Bill spoke out. Our moods instantly relaxed, and we all moved towards the door. Josh reached for the doorknob. The damn thing just creaked open by itself. The 7 of us stood there looking into the dark house. We made our way in and fired up a couple of lanterns that we brought with us. The ambiance in the house was definitely creepy. Low light from the lantern flickered in the living room where we sat, causing shadows to dance on the walls. The house was coated with dust and cobwebs. Most of the furniture was still inside from the family that died there. In fact, the house looked like a preserved scene, like something out of a museum. It was eerie to behold. Hell, there were even pictures of the family still lying around. It looked so normal, unsuspecting of the tragedy that would befall them. Me and the gang sat in those decrepit, blood-soaked walls, drinking and smoking the night away, talking and joking as we always did. We all toasted to the night and knocked back a few tequila shots apiece. Hunter grimaced as the liquor touched his tongue. We knew all of this was fucked up, but we carried on with our night. Hours passed, and we were all pretty drunk and high when James suddenly said he forgot something in the truck, and that he needed to rock a piss. He stood up and ran outside with one of the lanterns. He was gone for no more than a minute when he staggered back inside, with a jack-o'-lantern tucked under his left arm. He sat the thing down in the middle of the living room. It had a goofy smile carved into it, somewhat unsettling considering the atmosphere. "Is that your new girlfriend, man?" Hunter said as a grin cracked across his face. "Glad you're finally introducing us, James," I said before all of us busted into laughter.
"Yeah, really funny assholes," James said as his expression changed into a serious one. "I brought this pumpkin so that we can try to summon him." "Summon who? Your mom?" Harry said with not much response as the rest of us became intrigued.
James went on to explain the legend of Pumpkinhead, and how we were all going to attempt to summon him. Apparently, on Halloween night, if you surround an empty jack-o'-lantern with 13 black candles, place inside of it your own blood, and repeat a spell,
the being known as Pumpkinhead will appear and grant you what your heart desires. Hunter, Bill, Josh, and myself stood around as James and William spread the 13 black candles around the pumpkin, as Harry began to light them one by one with his rusted Zippo, a war token from his dad or something. He pulled out a pack of Camels and lit one up, taking a draw and exhaling the smoke. "So what do we do next? Give it a fucking kiss?" he said mockingly with a snicker. We all began to laugh, but James interrupted, still with that serious tone. "We have to give an offering of blood and repeat the spell in order to complete the ritual." Bill pulled out his Bowie knife, and we all took turns cutting our fingers and allowing our blood to drip inside of the jack-o'-lantern. He pulled out a piece of paper with a few lines written on it in red ink. We all joined hands around the pumpkin as we chanted the spell. "On this, the night of beasts and ghouls, we mortals plead as we follow your rules. Hear us as we call you to the mortal coil, and let not our plans be foiled. With our blood offering we bind you through fire, black candles numbering 13, to fulfill our deepest desires. Use this vessel to come to us. Obey our commands you must. Your time is short on the earthly plane. The sunrise following the devil's night shall be the end of your reign. Arise and appear now, Pumpkinhead." Silence gripped the air as we finished the chant. All sounds ceased, and my ears began ringing. The candles were still flickering and sputtering in front of us. We all stood there with our hands interlocked, staring at one another. Still quite impaired, if I recall correctly.
"James, your shitty spell didn't work,"
William said. We all bursted into a fit of laughter. We all stopped when we looked at James. Again, an eerie silence gripped the air. He was expressionless, and he was dead silent. And his eyes looked off. I do not exaggerate when I say this. His eyes were completely black. It's as if my friend was not in there or something. I'm not sure if you know what I'm talking about when I say this, but have you ever heard the noise of a pumpkin tearing? As if you were pulling one apart while carving it? That weird, disgusting sound as if flesh were being separated. That's what we all heard next. It was coming from the jack-o'-lantern, still sitting in the ring of candles that were surrounding it. My friends and I looked on in horror as the jack-o'-lantern's happy and goofy smile shifted and tore into a foul, sinister grin. At this moment, James' mouth opened in an unsightly yet impossible way, so wide that his jaw should have separated from his skull. He then let out a deep, resounding cackle as a strong, bone-chilling gust of wind slammed into us, leading to all 13 black candles, as well as the lanterns, to be extinguished. My friends and I were in utter darkness. I could hear heavy breathing and panic all around me as we had disconnected our hands by this point. I heard shuffling and crashing as some of us were obviously tripping over clutter in the house. Then a light flickered on. Harry had lit one of the lanterns and was standing close to me, the light illuminating his face. My eyes slowly adjusted and I could see my friends. Harry, Bill, Hunter, and William. I could see the ring of candles not far from where we were standing. The fucking pumpkin was gone. In addition, Josh and James were nowhere to be seen. "What the fuck was that?" Hunter said in a breathy, panicked tone, his eyes watering from fear.
"James is probably fucking with us,"
William said in a faulty, reassuring tone.
"He had to be. I mean, this shit was his idea after all."
"Did you all see his fucking eyes?" I said, raising my voice as it cracked somewhat from fear. They were completely black. How the fuck do you fake that?
Our bickering continued until we were interrupted by noise stirring in the kitchen. A crash, a thump, and then a blood-curdling scream. The scream of Josh. Our eyes were directed towards the pitch-black kitchen, when out of nowhere, a round object jolted out of the dark, landing on the hardwood floor and rolling to a stop at our feet. To our absolute horror, it was Josh's severed head, sitting right before us. A look of sheer terror and pain etched onto his face. Our bodies had no time to process the shock of seeing our friend's decapitated head, as we all started screaming. The 5 of us bolted towards the door as it slammed shut with such a great force, it shook the entire house. The black candles on the floor came back to life in a vibrant blaze as maniacal laughter echoed throughout the house. Footsteps were becoming louder as the silhouette of a figure started to slowly skulk from the kitchen, moving towards us. As it entered the dim light of the candles, our terror was magnified. The figure was none other than James, his entire body covered in fresh blood, a large kitchen knife in one hand, a fucking severed hand in the other. James was hunched over in a disgusting manner, and his posture seemed inhuman. But most disturbing was his head. He was wearing the fucking jack-o'-lantern we used in the ritual. A phosphorescent green light shining through the eye holes, and the evil grin even wider than before. He stopped just at the doorway and began to look us all over, like a predator looking at his prey. His head was bobbing back and forth like an animal as his gaze locked onto William. The poor guy had no time to react before the knife flew through the air and sunk deep into his head, his body collapsing onto the floor. At this point, we were all consumed by fear. Harry started to throw himself against the door as James began to inch closer towards us, but in a shifting motion unfit of a human. Bill pulled out his knife and was ready to kill James. As he lunged forward, Bill stabbed the knife deep into James's shoulder. Zack did not even faze him. He moved his head to the side and looked at the knife. He lunged forward, grabbing Bill by the throat and lifting him up against the wall as he began to cackle once more. Harry was still throwing his whole weight against that door, trying to get us the fuck out of that house with no luck. Hunter grabbed Harry and said, "Help me pick up this goddamn table. We'll break the fucking window." As we looked back at Bill, we heard an audible crack, and his head went limp, his neck now broken. James released him, his body crashing into a small end table, and then onto the floor. James now stood over Bill, who was lightly twitching on the floor, as he proceeded to pull the knife from his shoulder without so much as a flinch, blood spurting out onto the floor. James's head mechanically shifted towards us, then back to Bill, as he plunged the knife into his throat, killing him instantly. James began to violently stab Bill over and over again as he grunted and laughed. I've never seen anything so sadistic and monstrous in my life. "We have to fucking go right fucking now!" Hunter screamed, as he and Harry threw the coffee table through the window, shattering it into pieces. Hunter leaped through the improvised exit, as Harry grabbed me forcefully by the arm and pulled me through the window along with himself. We ran as fast as we could down the dirt road that led us to the house. The truck was in sight, and lucky for us, William had left the keys in it. Guess it wasn't going to do him much good now. By this point, my heart was in my throat, and my chest was burning as if every breath I took was churning the fire. We were home free. We were going to make it. These thoughts were running through my head as rapid, heavy footsteps started coming from directly behind us. It was James. He was running faster than any man should have been able to, but his quick steps were staggered side to side, with his arms outstretched behind him.
He was gaining on us. We got to the truck as I hopped into the driver's seat. Harry tore at the passenger door with great force and he yelled for Hunter to get in. "Get your ass in, Hunter, and be fucking quick about it," he said as sweat dripped off his face. Hunter flew in, crashing into me as he did. Harry had just slid into the truck as a sickly, chunking sound erupted. He coughed and violently spit up blood, spraying it all over Hunter's face. We both looked on in horror as James stood behind Harry, his hands on the axe that was buried in Harry's back. James quickly jerked the axe handle as it ripped out of Harry's body, thick blood pouring out of his mouth and into the truck floor. James then grabbed Harry, slammed his head into the side of the truck, and threw him to the ground. "Fucking help me, you useless dicks!" he choked out as blood dripped out of his mouth, his eyeball almost popping out of his goddamn skull. His hand stretched out towards us as he begged. We were paralyzed. There was nothing I could do, let alone Hunter. The funny thing is, in that moment, I wanted to help. I was fit. I had a black belt in karate. And I knew deep down I could do nothing. So I made a terrible decision to save my ass, as well as Hunter's. I had to at least save one of my friends. Instinctively, I rammed the key into the ignition, and the truck turned over. I popped the piece of shit in reverse, and squealed off of the dirt road onto the pavement, slinging gravel and dirt behind us. The scene began to become smaller and smaller as we flew down the road. I happened to glance in my rearview mirror and saw James bury the axe into Harry's head with a heavy blow. My friends were all either dead or fucking crazy at this point. Josh, William, Bill, Harry, all just gone. James was now free to roam our town and do God knows what. Hunter was murmuring while holding himself and rocking back and forth while I drove, covered in blood. I was silent, simply replaying the whole night in my head. I still do not understand it all. Even after years have come and gone, how did a silly legend cause this much damage? We drove to the police station, and I ran inside to tell the authorities what had happened. Everything. The ritual, the killings, James, all of it. Sheriff's Deputy Doyle took my statement and attempted to talk to Hunter, but he was mute following the incident, unable to say a single word. They did not believe any of the supernatural aspects and summed it up to a mental break on James' part. I thought they were right back then. James had become a bit reclusive, playing too many video games, rarely hanging out with us. The cops had not seen anything this exciting in their careers, so they suited up and droves of them converged on the house. I heard after the fact the police entered the property and found Harry first. A visible wound on his back, as well as the side of his head, with the killing blow being a deep axe blow to the head. Bill was discovered next, his neck broken, and well over 20 stab wounds to his body, the one to his neck nearly decapitating him. William was next, with a kitchen knife buried so deeply in his skull, it nearly went all the way through. Josh's body, save his head and one of his hands, was found in the kitchen, his body stabbed numerous times. The most shocking discovery that the officers made, however, was a head tucked neatly in the refrigerator. The head of James, clearly recognizable. His eyes had been removed, and his head had been hollowed out, like a jack-o'-lantern. When I heard the news, I was in shock. But so were the authorities. James was their fall guy, the man to pin these murders on. But with his head being found, he obviously couldn't have beheaded himself and dug his own fucking brains and eyeballs out. It made no sense. The police knew that someone else had to be to blame, and my story made me look like a madman. But I did not care about any of that shit. My mind was occupied with the head. The head was in the refrigerator the whole time. That thing picked us off one by one. James, if you can call him that, was not wearing the pumpkin over his own head. That was his fucking head. In addition, several other bodies were found on November 1st. If I recall, the sheriff's office found another 5 or so bodies of local children, still wearing their Halloween costumes. James' body was never found. It still bothers me. Slowly but surely, the parents of my friends and the other kids buried what remained of their children, and I lost so much of my former self. Hunter is still just a shell, muttering nonsense and reliving the night over and over again within his own subconscious. I left Melbrook Hollow as soon as I could. I'm now married and have a child of my own. I'm in no way recovered, but I managed to get by. My mind still slips towards madness every time I think of that Halloween. For the most part, I'm happy with my new life. I was led to believe my friend of many years snapped and brutally murdered all of these people initially, and his head allowed me to finally piece together what had actually occurred. We thought that the ritual that night had been a fluke, a scary story to frighten those who heard it, but we had succeeded in summoning that demon known as Pumpkinhead, and we paid the price. So if my story has any lesson behind it, it would be to not summon Pumpkinhead to our realm. It will not go well for you.
I'm Scared of Halloween. Written and narrated by Lady Spookaria. Have you ever lived in a house for years with absolutely no problems at all? Then suddenly things begin to happen and you wonder what you did to upset the ghosts in your house. I've lived in this house with my mum, dad, 3 sisters and my grandpa after my grandma passed away. My house has been haunted for as long as I can remember. Occasionally you would see spirits standing at the foot of your bed, watching you. I would even say that the spirits were protective of us. When there was a fire, they alerted us to let us know it was time to escape. I felt a chill, cold hand on my cheek during the night. I awoke with a fright to see a semi-transparent girl beside me. She pointed to the door, whispered, "Fire." The smoke filled the hallway and we ran outside, managing to escape. I looked up to my bedroom window and saw her staring down at us, a somber expression on her tiny face. There were 2 other ghosts that resided in the house with us. An elderly gentleman. He hated loud music and always expected us to behave like ladies. So he would throw the odd book at us when we swore or got really angry if we brought a boy home. He liked to hang out in the study. Never spoke much though. Then there was a middle-aged woman. I think she was a maid a long time ago. If something is in the wrong place, it will go missing before appearing in the right one. The spirits have always been helpful towards us. Almost part of the family. It changed when Halloween rolled around last year. There were the usual trick-or-treaters. We'd open the door and admire their costumes, give them some candy, and watch a scary movie or 2. There was a strange woman who came to the door. She only knocked once. There was an instant change in the air. A chill, cold dread over the entire house. On the doorstep was a woman garbed in Victorian attire, pale as the moon, and we could not see her eyes. Her lips were stained red, and she smiled. We stared at her in confusion. before my sister murmured a small, "Hello?" "May I come in?" she asked. Her voice was smooth and alluring. We both were eagerly about to grant her permission when the door was forced shut, locked, and outside we heard a loud, mocking laugh. When I looked through the peephole, she was gone. After that, the spirits became restless and angry. Each of us began having nightmares at night. And the ghosts, they became sadistic towards us. They would scratch us, wake us up, bite us, whisper at us that they want to kill us. And one time, I was in the library doing homework. The old man's hands went around my neck. I was frozen, unable to move. I felt his hands tighten around my throat. My breath became sharp. In the reflection, I could see his slender arms and bearded face. Before, all the ghosts always looked more human, their faces kinder. This time, he looked skeletal, demonic, and his eyes glowed orange. He leaned down to whisper in my ear. "Run before Halloween. She will be back," he whispered, a hint of desperation and fear in his voice. Briefly, his old expression returned before he disappeared. How did this woman turn the ghost against the rest of the family? How? I asked. He looked as though he was about to speak. The words caught in his tongue before he vanished. There was a pause. I looked down at my phone. It was the 30th of October, the day before Halloween. Again, I felt eyes on me. A vase crashed against the wall, broke and shattered on the floor into pieces. I heard screams in the distance. I pushed back my chair, ran towards the room, and saw my sister pinned, the little girl's hands around her throat. I ran towards them to try to pry them apart when I saw them whispering to each other. The little girl disappeared. My sister fell to the floor with a loud bang. She looked like a fallen doll and slumped forward. She clutched her ears, sobbed, and her small body shook violently with each passing sob. My arms instantly went around her shoulders. All she murmured was a soft, She told me to leave. It continued to raise more questions than answers. The maid had attacked my mother and she refused to speak a word about it. Every ghost demanded we leave, but why? One morning I was in the kitchen washing dishes when a foul odor hit me. I coughed and gagged, clutched my mouth and ran outside to get some fresh air. I wanted to move, to leave, but we had nowhere else to go. I noticed the door to the crawl space under the house was open. Normally it was locked to protect the local dogs, cats, or possums from going inside. I was drawn to the space, and I had to crawl through the maze. There were cobwebs sticking to my hair, and I had to keep an eye out for spiders. There was a wooden box, old and covered in a thick layer of dust. I struggled to open it as it had rusted over. Unsure of what to do, I dragged it outside into the sunlight before prying it open with a crack. Inside were old black and white photos. They'd been preserved. However, there were signs of water damage. The first image was the maid. She'd been standing to one side, but I could clearly make out her features. I flipped it over. It spoke about a woman with a scratched out face in the picture. The next one was the old man. I recognized him clearly, as he was the ghost I spent the most time with, and flipped it over. It had his name. John Carpenter. His birthday and the date he passed away. Otherwise, it was quite uneventful. The final picture was a little girl with a doll in her arms. The same girl I saw regularly. I placed the photographs beside me and rummaged through the box. There was an old journal. I nearly missed it, but there was one final photograph. It was the woman who arrived on Halloween a year ago. She hadn't aged. She hadn't changed. Even the photograph alone gave me an uncertain feeling in my stomach, as though she was looking at me through the photograph. I gulped, turned it over, and opened the journal. The handwriting was cursive, chaotic and beautiful at the same time. I skipped to the final page and figured it would have the answers I craved. The final page was dated the 31st of October, 1891. It worked. It cost me in blood. My father, daughter, and maid are dead. I can feel it. I have become immortal through him. I have to return to this place on All Hallows Eve to renew the ritual. My eyes widened at this. The ghost had never spoken about how or why they died. I kept reading. With each new family, my power will grow stronger and stronger. I will be the terror in the world. I bound their souls to the house, and they tried to fight me. Every year they weakened my wishes. They become weaker, and I become stronger. What the hell? I dropped the book and shook my head. I believed in ghosts. I knew them. I had to get my family out of the house. As I stood up, I murmured to myself how I was going to explain this to the ghosts and see if they had any answers for me. I took the box with all the items I needed. I ran back inside the house. I know what happened. I know who she is. How can I help you? You don't need to do this, I called out to the empty walls. I received no answer in response. Please, listen to me. Again, more silence. I couldn't feel them anywhere. I reached out with my hand and walked down the hallway. Anything to try to find where they were. It was getting dark outside. The house was becoming chilly. The kind where your bones would ache and burn. The lights faded and the normally bright house was grey. Outside, I could hear the trick-or-treaters begin their passage. I knew what I had to do. I had to get my family out of my house. I kept walking around and began to cough. It was only then that I saw them outside peering through the window, holding each other and sobbing. I tried to open the front door. It felt as though it was dead-bolted and I choked. I hit the doors and the windows, crying out for them to help me. I had to break a window to get out. I ran towards the dining room. My hands tightly gripped a chair, lifted it up into the air, and it was caught. I turned to see the woman from before, the murderess. Her clawed hand went around my throat, squeezed tightly, and I felt the world disappear. I was in a dreamless sleep. A dream. Thank fuck it was just a dream. I woke up curled up on the floor. Around me were boxes of my family's property. The furniture had been wrapped up, and I awkwardly stood up. There was a sign outside the front of my house. Hello? Hello? Mom? Where is... I felt arms wrap around my waist and looked down to see a familiar face. It was the little girl. She looked... human. All the demonic signs were gone. Hi. You're one of us now. You're not going to leave now. One of us? I questioned, and looked down at her face, shaking my head. The realization of what that meant sank in. It meant I was dead. Mom? Where are you? It was a long time for you. You woke up later, and they're moving out now. I couldn't be dead. Then I remembered the smoke and her hand around my neck. I remembered life leaving my body. I found the journal again, and it said, "I have added another to my collection, and I will only grow stronger."
A world traveler went missing in the mountains near my town. Don't try to find her no matter how much they offer. This story I'm about to tell you is 100% real, and it comes from the area that I live in. My town is not rural, but it's not big, and we are surrounded by mountains. By word of mouth, there were particular places in these mountains that are forbidden places. Not because they are owned by anyone, but just because of the mystery that sprouts out from them. My city is hundreds of years old, and it has so many different cultures mixed into it that we have a good amount of ghost stories as well. This one true story of a person who has gone missing in one of these areas is one that still scares me every time I hear it, because it makes no sense. To this day, you are still able to see the plaque of this missing person strung up on a tree off the side of an old dirt road that my family and I ride our ATVs on. On the plaque, they offer money to the person who could find her body, which is still up there. The area she went missing in, or at least the road, is called the Devil's Pass, but I'm not for sure on this. I've heard other people refer to it like this, but it may not be its official name, so let me tell you why her disappearance is so strange. She was a world traveler and had gone to every continent, so she had to have been good with maps. Also, according to her children, she had been to the destination she was trying to get to before, which was off of a paving road. Somehow, she ended up pulling off of the paved road onto an old, rocky dirt path, which leads into the forbidden territory. At night is mainly when the area is supposedly dangerous to be in, and I have only been there during daylight hours, and I never left the road. However, there is a feeling of being watched while you are in this area, and it just has an unsettling presence. Or this might just be because of all the stories I've heard behind it that makes me paranoid of it. Anyway, the lady for some reason didn't stop and just kept on going. She ended up getting high-centered and couldn't drive anymore according to the police report. Now some of you are going to say that she was drunk and that's why she kept on driving in the middle of the woods, and the police thought the same thing, until the woman's daughter informed them that she had called her mother while she was driving there. Before she lost the phone signal, her daughter had told them that when they had talked, she sounded perfectly fine, and that she wasn't slurring her words at all. So to continue with the story, the woman gets out of her car and checks to see if there was any way to get unstuck. It was a rainy summer night, and when the cops arrived at the crime scene, they could see her footprints. They never left the perimeter of the car also, but for some scary reason, she was nowhere to be seen. They brought out forest rangers, volunteers, and even dogs to find her. The dogs never tracked her scent any farther than 10 feet from the car. It was as if she vanished off the face of the earth. Her body is still up there, and it's been around 25 years since it happened. And yet, there's still no sign of her. The award of finding her body still stands though, which is more than $1,000, but I would never try it. That area is not meant to be gone into, let alone searched. No one knows why it's cursed in my town, but the stories date back to the early 16th century when it was first settled. I'm scared actually of sharing this story. If you talk about the area a lot, bad things seem to happen to you. I'm not superstitious about much, unless it involves this place. I was going to go camping close to that area with a bunch of friends from high school, but when I told my mom, she without hesitation said no. It was a no that didn't matter under any other circumstances because it would not change. I'll finish by saying that there are things in this world that shouldn't be explored. And this happens to be one of them.